welcome on a winter spring day. Our guest today, Dr. Genie Scott, will also be meeting again with the honors class and all those interested in continuing the discussion and the dialogue in the Student Center TV Lounge. And we would invite any of you who would like to join us to move that direction following the lecture. A very active member of our lecture committee this year and your science senator, Jared Gray, will do introduction today, and I'd like to thank Jared for his participation on the committee. He's also an active voice in our honors class this quarter, and I'll turn the time to Jared.
Since 1987, our speaker has been the executive director of the National Center for Science Education Incorporated, a pro-evolution nonprofit science education organization with members in every state. She holds a PhD in physical anthropology from the University of Missouri and has taught in the University of Kentucky, University of Colorado, and in the California State University system. She has served as a chair of the Ethics Committee of the American Anthropological Association and serves as Secretary-Treasurer of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists. She is nationally recognized as a proponent of church-state separation and serves on the National Advisory Council of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, on the National Advisory Council of Americans for Religious Liberty, and on the Executive Committee of the National Coalition for Public Education and Religious Liberty. She has been both a researcher and an activist in the creationism evolution controversy for several years, and can speak of problems created by this sectarian challenge to science education from many directions: educational, legal, scientific, and/or social. A dynamic speaker, she has appeared on Hour Magazine, Geraldo, Crossfire, Issues on Trial, Morning Edition, The Pat Buchanan Show, and All Things Considered. Let's offer a warm welcome to Dr. Genie Scott.
Good morning. It's really wonderful to be back in the high desert country. Actually, it's more than 20 years ago now. In my earlier incarnation as a university anthropologist, I spent a fair amount of time in the Four Corners area at the Indian reservations and just enjoying your beautiful country here. It was lovely to wake up this morning and open my drapes of the motel and see this lovely mountains and the snow-covered, the sprinkles of powdered sugar snow on top. It was great. It's very nice to be here. I work for an organization called the National Center for Science Education. This is kind of what it feels like around here. This is a membership organization composed of scientists, teachers, and interested citizens who are concerned about two things: the teaching of evolution and scientific literacy. NCSE got its start in the early 80s when a group of scientists and teachers became concerned when scientific creationists began introducing legislation to require the teaching of creationism when evolution was taught. The scientific creationists are anti-evolutionists, and I may have more to say about them later, but it goes without saying that anti-evolutionism has a strong foothold in American society. Can I have the first slide, please? A recent Gallup poll stated that 47% of American adults accept the basic tenet of young Earth creationism. The question that Gallup asks, and they ask it properly, they phrase the question well: God created man pretty much in his present form at one time within the last 10,000 years. 47% of adult Americans agreed or agreed strongly to this. Well, why is there so much anti-evolutionism? I would argue that the 47% shown in the Gallup poll and echoed by many others reflects a basic misunderstanding of what science is and what evolution is. You can turn that slide off now, thank you. But there is also an important theological issue involved, which I want to address at least briefly. I find it useful to think of the creation-evolution controversy as a continuum rather than a dichotomy. I think there's a lot of confusion about this. People, can you hear me okay when I move away from that mic? This is a good AV system. You can't. Should I carry this with me wherever I go? I can do that. You know, we talk about the creation-evolution controversy as if there are only two sides to this. But I want to try to introduce the idea to you that we really have a continuum, not a dichotomy. We go from creation to evolution, and the first group that I want to talk about are the flat earthers. Now, the flat earthers are a rather small component of the creationist camp. There are flat earthers. The International Flat Earth Society is run by a man named Charles K. Johnson. He lives in Lancaster, California. He's got about 250 members, and he does indeed believe that the earth is flat, and the earth is flat because the Bible says it is. Lancaster, California is over sort of it's in Southern California, over kind of near the Nevada border, and if you know anything about that kind of country, you may understand why he thinks the earth is flat. But he is something of a minority in this field, no question. Geocentrists, though, are a somewhat stronger group within the creationist movement. They believe that the earth is the center of the solar system, geocentrism, as opposed to heliocentrism, which is, of course, that the sun is the center of the solar system. And the geocentrists believe that the earth is the center and the sun goes around it because that's what it says in the Bible, and that's good enough for them. They are a smaller component of the modern creationist movement than some of the other groups that I'll talk about, but they are not insubstantial. There was, in fact, in 1986, at the National Bible Science Association conference in Cleveland, a plenary session, a keynote debate between a geocentrist and a heliocentrist. Now, this was 1986, not 1686, that they were seriously debating this issue. The young earth creationists are the mainstay of the modern creationism movement. This is the Institute for Creation Research, the Bible Science Association. These are individuals who believe that special creation occurred, that all the plants and animals and the planets and the solar system and the universe and the galaxies, the whole shebang of the universe was all created specially, all at one time. And they further believe that this special creation event occurred a relatively short time ago. This occurred only within 10 or 20,000 years. The old earth creationists are also special creationists. They feel the whole universe was created specially. All the plants and animals were created individually. All the kinds of animals were created individually. But the old earth creationists at least accept some modern science in that they agree with modern physics and chemistry that the earth is very old. They have no problem with radiometric dating. There are a number of subspecies, as it were, of old earth creationists that are kind of interesting from a scholarly standpoint. There are gap creationists who believe that the 6 days of Genesis in the Bible were actual 24-hour days, but that the days had very long periods of time in between them. So there was a 24-hour day of day one, and then a very, very long period of time, and then a second creation day of day two and a long period of time. So that way they accommodate a modern science's reflection that the earth and the universe is very old with the literal interpretation of the Bible. There also are day-age creationists among the old earthers. These are individuals who believe that the days of Genesis are not 24-hour days, but rather long periods of time. Whether they're old earthers or young earthers, these two kinds of creationists are both united in their concern that the universe was specially created by God, and particularly that plants and animals were created according to kinds and did not evolve from earlier forms. Theistic evolutionists are probably, if you really were to sort of take most religious Americans and pin them down on the mat and say, okay, what do you really, really, really believe? Probably most Americans would be some sort of theistic evolutionist. Theistic evolutionists are individuals who believe that God created, but God created using the process of evolution. This is the view that is taught, in fact, in the majority of seminaries in the United States for Protestants and Catholics. The Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, United Church of Christ, and of course the Catholics, and Reformed Jews, and even most of the Orthodox Jewish training institutions, will teach that the Bible is not to be interpreted as a literal document. It is a truthful document. It has spiritual value, but it's not literally true that the earth is the center of the universe. It is not literally true that the earth is flat. It is not literally true that the plants and animals were created separately 10,000 years ago. Theistic evolutionists are representative of the ministers who belong to my organization, and the ministers with whom I deal in this controversy. They believe that evolution is fine. There's no problem with evolution having taken place. It was God's way of bringing about the world that he had in mind. But evolution is something that occurred. On the end of the creation-evolution continuum are materialistic evolutionists. And this is philosophical materialism specifically. This is the view that is held by, say, Carl Sagan, William Provine, some other scientists that are perhaps prominent, that yes, indeed, evolution did take place, and because we can explain it using material causes, using natural causes, that therefore we can reject the idea of a God, that there is no supernatural, that God does not exist, and that basically we can get along just fine without religion. This is, remember, a philosophical continuum rather than a scientific continuum. I'll be speaking a little bit later about differences between materialism as a philosophy versus materialism as an important component of science, of methodological materialism, if you will. Well, so basically everybody kind of from here on up on this continuum rejects the idea of evolution. Can I have this projector on, please? Well, why do people object to evolution? What is it about evolution that is so offensive to many people? First, because it is evil. Modern anti-evolutionists feel that if evolution is true, then man has no purpose. Therefore, there is no God, and therefore there's no need for religion. Society is going to go to hell in a handbag, because without religion, there will be no moral compass to guide us and keep us from doing evil to one another. Needless to say, each of these statements and the connections between them have been strongly challenged by philosophers, theologians, and scientists. Nonetheless, Henry Morris, head of the Institute for Creation Research, is adamant about evolution being evil. He says here in his book, Twilight of Evolution, evolution is at the foundation of communism, fascism, Freudianism, social Darwinism, behaviorism, Kinseyism, materialism, atheism, and in the religious world, modernism and neo-orthodoxy. Jesus said a good tree cannot bring forth corrupt fruit. In view of the bitter fruit yielded by the evolutionary system over the past 100 years, a closer look at the nature of the tree itself is well warranted today. This tree metaphor, by the way, is used quite a bit in creationist literature. This is from the Bible Science newsletter a number of years ago. You can see here you have a lot of evils. Look at the branches of the tree. You've got acceptance of homosexuality, euthanasia, abortion, atheism, runaway taxing, relativistic law, oppression, communism. There's also this whole branch. I've never understood the parallelism in this tree. You know, there's this whole branch called science with biology and geology and medicine. Is this supposed to be? I don't even want to get into that. But okay, here's this tree of evil that is afflicting society. Humanism, according to these people, is the source of that evil. They also don't know anything about humanism, but that's another lecture. The source of humanism, according to these people, is what? Evolution. So their general idea, go ahead and leave the slides on, the transparency will wipe them out. That's one of the lovely things about transparencies. The point of this is that if you could only get rid of evolution, all of these other evils will go away. This is a somewhat more recent version of that Bible Science. I was wrong. Could you flip off the slides for just an instant, please? Usually the transparency does take care of slides, but you've got a powerful projector back there. This is a slightly more recent version of that same Bible Science Association tree. This is, again, the Bible Science Association meeting in Minneapolis in '92. Humanism, racism, paganism. They've added radical feminists, but I digress. Abortion. All of these evils, you see, are the result of evolution in our society, and the creation science message will chop off these evils at their source, and therefore we will have a much happier world. Slides, please. There is, here we go. Henry Morris even states that not only is evolution leading us to all of these terrible things and ideas in our society and culture, but it's actually the plan of the devil himself to do this. Well, evolution must be a pretty awful idea to have generated all of these, this very strong opposition. I'm trusting that those of you who have been taking this seminar series for a number of weeks are already pretty familiar with what evolution really is and know the difference between this caricature presented by creation scientists and what scientists do. Could you turn the slides off, please? Thank you. I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of anti-evolutionism and then return to this idea of the religiously based opposition to evolution. The history of creationism and evolution has taken 3 phases in the United States. The first was the attempt to simply ban evolution. The historian Edward Larson and also Ronald Numbers cite data to show that by the 1910s of the century, life science courses consistently presented evolution to American secondary school students. On the other hand, in 1910, not that many American students were in high school. There was a terrific growth of secondary school education in the first few decades of this century. In 1890, fewer than 4% of the children in the 14 through 17 age group were attending secondary school. Some of you might think that was a big advantage, I don't know. The number of students doubled each decade, from 500,000 students in 1900 to almost 2 million students in 1920. Well, what this meant was that more students, more young people were being exposed to this evil idea of evolution. William Jennings Bryan himself recognized that the small percentage of students going on to secondary school was the only reason that Darwinism, as he said, has not done more harm. 37 laws were introduced into 20 states to ban the teaching of evolution between 1921 and 1929. By the end of the decade, fully 45 bills had been introduced, mostly in southern states, but also in Minnesota, New York, and some other non-southern states. The first anti-evolution law was passed in Oklahoma in 1923, the next in Florida in the same year, and in Tennessee in 1925. An anti-evolution law was passed which set the stage for the Scopes trial. Now everybody knows about the Scopes trial. Everybody knows H.L. Mencken's version of the Scopes trial. And forget that Scopes was convicted. Scopes lost, right? And the law banning the teaching of evolution in Tennessee stayed on the books until 1968. That is well within the lifespan of a number of us here. In fact, I was in college, but never mind. There were, in fact, anti-evolution laws passed in 2 states after Scopes, in Mississippi and Arkansas. Plus, a few months after the so-called evolutionist victory of Scopes, the Texas Textbook Commission ordered the deletion of evolution from all public school textbooks, and Louisiana followed suit in 1926. The amount of evolution taught in American secondary schools actually decreased after Scopes. The pointy-headed intellectuals reading the big Eastern newspapers and ridiculing the backwoods Southerners weren't the ones buying textbooks. And textbook publishers found that books that had too much evolution in them didn't sell. Local districts could have rules against the teaching of evolution even if a state did not. One writer in 1930 estimated that 70%, 70, of public high schools did not teach evolution. Evolution was effectively dead in American public schools 5 years after the Scopes trial. Some evolutionist victory. In 1957, the Soviets set up Sputnik, the first satellite, and the American scientific establishment reeled in shock. The federal government began pouring money into education to try to keep the United States from falling behind in science. One of the programs was to get university scientists involved in writing textbooks. The Biological Sciences Curriculum Study, the BSCS, was founded in 1959 and involved some of the finest minds in biology. Needless to say, when these scientists took a look at the books that were being used to teach biology, they unglued and set about just rewriting from scratch these ridiculous textbooks and putting evolution smack in the middle of the biology curriculum. As Edward Larson says, quote, "The appearance of the BSCS texts in the early 60s shattered the 30-year truce in legal activities enveloping the anti-evolution issue. Within a few years, BSCS controlled half the market, and other publishers were beginning to put out books modeled upon theirs." John Moore, one of the early BSCS scientists, describes these days, and it's kind of a fun quote. He says, "Subsequent events showed that nearly every objecting school board ended up adopting the books, evolution, sex, and all. Word was spreading that BSCS biology was the new thing, and there were community pressures on school boards to be up to date, even if a little wicked, rather than behind the times and fully virtuous. Once the situation was understood, nearly every newly published biology book included an explicit discussion of evolution." One of the books that returned evolution to its pages was Modern Biology by Otto and Toll. It was the book that Arkansas high school teacher Susan Epperson used, and which the Arkansas Education Association used to test Arkansas's anti-evolution law in 1965. The Supreme Court decided in 1968 that anti-evolution laws were unconstitutional because they, in effect, promoted religion and ran into the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. once the Epperson case allowed teachers to begin teaching evolution, creationists had to come up with some other way of getting rid of evolution. Now, if the literal interpretation of Genesis could somehow be presented as a scientifically valid view, as an alternative scientific view, then it could legitimately be taught without running into the First Amendment. And the second stage of the anti-evolution or creationist movement in America, scientific creationism, began. Now, there had been some attempts to make a literal reading of Genesis compatible with modern science for quite some time, some dating, in fact, back to Darwin's day. Henry Morris had written The Genesis Flood in 1961, presenting the foundation scientific basis for young Earth creationism. The Creation Research Society was founded in 1963, about the same time as evolution was making its way back into textbooks. But after the 1968 Epperson case, American anti-evolutionists began seriously searching for scientific evidence with renewed vigor. During the mid to late 1970s, creationists attempted to get laws introduced into legislatures around the country that would mandate the teaching of creation science with evolution. 23 states had such legislation presented, and scientists in many of these states testified against such bills. 2 states passed equal time legislation, and both were challenged in the courts immediately. Arkansas came to trial first, and it was a full-blown trial, with some of the best scientists in the country testifying on the evolution side and a cast of unknowns on the creationist side. Among the evolutionists, Stephen Jay Gould, Francisco Ayala, Brent Dalrymple, Michael Roos, and the theologian Langdon Gilkey were articulate and convincing. Reading the accounts of this trial is really a kick. If you ever get a chance to do that, come out to NCSE and look at our archives. The ACLU lawyers really didn't know anything about science, but they were very bright and they learned very quickly. And in depositions, and then therefore, of course, on the stand, they actually got the creation scientists to admit to some just incredibly ridiculous statements, and which just destroyed their credibility completely with the judge. They got one creation scientist to admit that he had indeed published on the idea that UFOs were really manifestations of Satan, and got another one on the stand to admit that he had written an article in which he had said that insects were really smarter than people, but they just weren't letting on. So, they didn't have a whole lot of credibility. The judge in the Arkansas trial concluded very importantly for the evolution side of this issue that creation science was not science at all. It did not meet the precepts of science. It did not meet the definition of science that scientists use. And very strongly, I think, supported that. This is a quote from the decision in McLean versus Arkansas. The methodology employed by creationists is another factor which indicative that their work is not science. A scientific theory must be tentative and always subject to revision or abandonment in light of facts that are inconsistent with or falsify the theory. A theory that is by its own terms dogmatic, absolutist, and never subject to revision is not a scientific theory. Now that's very interesting. The creation scientists will criticize something like paleoanthropology. I understand Don Johansson spoke to you a few weeks ago. They'll say, well, evolution isn't science. You people are always changing your minds. This is what you call unclear on the concept. It is the nature of scientific explanations to change. It's one of the things that distinguishes the scientific way of knowing from revealed truth. The creationist methods do not take data, weigh it against the opposing scientific data, and thereafter reach the conclusion stated in the section of the bill. Instead, they take the literal wording of the book of Genesis and attempt to find scientific support for this. What they also do is eliminate all discomfiting or non-conforming data. Things went so badly for the creationists in the Arkansas trial that they didn't even appeal. Now, the Louisiana law was also challenged, and it went to trial, but there was not a full court trial like there was in Arkansas, which was really too bad, because from my standpoint, the Louisiana case was really, or the Arkansas case would have been better to go to court. But the Louisiana summary judgment was eventually appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and in Edwards versus Aguilard, the Supreme Court ruled that creation science was a religious doctrine. Advocating creationism is an establishment of religion. You know, I've taught long enough to realize that if I leave this on the screen, you're all going to read it and you're not going to listen to me. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take this off, because otherwise, you're going to miss all these wonderful points that I'm going to be making in the next couple of minutes. Now, unfortunately, the Edwards versus Aguillard Supreme Court decision, although it does take precedence because it's a Supreme Court decision, it's relative to the entire country, it was rather narrowly argued, and it left some loopholes that modern-day creation scientists are exploiting. This leads us to our third period of history in the creation-evolution controversy. I've invented this term. Maybe it'll stick. I call it Neocreationism. If nothing else has evolved, creation science has evolved. And Neocreationism refers to what happened to creation science after the Aguillard decision, when they had to drop the term creationism because the Aguillard decision said creationism is religion. So now what we have in the current day creation-evolution struggle, which in the question period I can go into in more detail, what we have today is a series of euphemisms that mean the same thing as creation science, but don't use the C word. That's really what we're talking about here. Intelligent design theory is one of them. My absolute favorite euphemism for just pure obfuscation, I just think it's wonderful, is abrupt appearance theory. Yes. Arguments against evolution is another euphemism for creation science, and if we have time, I'd be happy to discuss this more with you later. Well, as I mentioned before, opposition to evolution is ultimately religiously based. There is not a great falling away of confidence about evolution in the scientific world. It's not because the scientific evidence is weak for evolution or something like that. It's a religiously based opposition. And I'd like to suggest that, and I'm going to say this really carefully, I'll even turn out all distracting influences here. I'd like to suggest that the anti-evolutionism that we see today is due to a profound disruption that evolution causes to the Western culture origin myth, which happens to be that of Genesis. But that this disruption is more apparent than real, and can and has been dealt with by philosophers and theologians who feel Christianity can accommodate evolution. Now, here's the important part. I use the word myth. A philosopher once said that one's own origin account is unshakable truth and everybody else's is just mythology. I'd like to try to get in a good word for myth because I'm not using myth in a pejorative sense. We sometimes get the idea that if something is myth, it's therefore not true. We sometimes use the word myth as a synonym for falseness or something that's inaccurate or something that we shouldn't respect. Anthropologists disagree. One has to understand something very important about myth. Mythology is a symbolic way of expressing truth, and myth-making is probably the true human universal. It's hard to find universals that are found in every culture, in every society of human beings, but myth-making is one that we have found in anthropology. Langdon Gilkey, in his book Maker of Heaven and Earth, discusses the role of myth in any human society. He points out that myth, by being symbolic, cannot be taken literally. And there are conventions that are found in any language in any society that tell the member of that society that what they're about to hear or what they're about to read is symbolic rather than literally true. Once upon a time. Okay? That has variants in languages all over the world. The phrase and its equivalents tell the listener that what you're going to hear is not of the present. It may deal with events it's going to deal with events that may or may not have occurred. It's something you put in a different realm from it's raining outside. There are factual statements that we make, and then we say in the beginning, or we say once upon a time. One convention found in both Europe and Africa is an anthropomorphic or human-centered locus for the myth. We have talking animals, we have talking trees, we have talking objects. The velveteen rabbit, right? The tortoise and the hare, Brer Rabbit and all the other brothers, and even talking steam engines. In Genesis, we have talking snakes. Once you're aware of the conventions of myth, you know you're in that world. You know you're in the world of myth, not the world of fact. But that doesn't mean that you're in a world of untruth, okay? Just because you're in the world of myth doesn't mean that you're in a world of falsehood. That Brer Rabbit can outwit Brer Fox expresses truths that we believe, that cleverness can prevail over strength. And the exertions of the little engine that could expresses strongly held beliefs in our culture about the virtue of persistence in the face of adversity. You're not supposed to take literally the idea of talking steam engines. You miss the point if you do. Now, in some cases, myths do try to explain the natural world. Lightning was produced by Zeus throwing thunderbolts or Vulcan hammering on his anvil. To the ancient Norse, the aurora borealis were reflections off the shields of the Valkyries. And obviously, modern science has provided us with better explanations than Zeus's thunderbolts. That the aurora borealis is caused by solar winds interacting with the Earth's magnetic field and atmospheric gases is, of course, a better explanation than the shiny shields of the warrior maidens. But origin myths, by definition, are attempting to explain even more than how things work. They want to explain how did everything get here? Why? Who did it? The sun, the moon, and stars in primitive mythology are often characters who first lived on Earth, but then, after a series of adventures or misfortunes, ended up in the sky. Ancient Norse believed that the land, seas, and the mountains came about when Odin, Vil, and Ve made the world from the body of the giant Ymir, using his blood for oceans, his bones for mountains, his hair for trees, and so forth. According to the Eskimo, animals originated when the sea witch Sedna cut off her fingers and dropped them in the ocean, and they swam away as seals and walruses and other mammals. And of course, the origin of mankind is explained in myth as well. This is a bark painting, of Australian Aborigines. The Jangawal sisters, who are their kind of culture heroes, are giving birth to the Australian Aborigines. Now, it's true that science has given us better explanations for some of these origins as well. Most people would find continental drift a more satisfactory explanation of how the continents got to be where they were than being a byproduct of Odin's skill at dissection. But remember that origin myths, like all myths, are symbolic and reflect a different kind of truth than empirical truth. What is it all for? Why is everything like it is rather than some other way? And the cliche question, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose for me to be here? I'm not sure that science per se can even answer questions like this. I think one of the errors that scientists have made through the years is expressing science, some of them, not me, some not many, but I think there's an error to be made if science is expressed as a way of knowing that can explain everything human beings are concerned about or curious about. I love my daughter. I could probably explain my feeling for my daughter about perinatal hormones that came about when 11 years ago when she was born, and I could probably reduce it into a variety of hormonal and behavioral reactions, but that wouldn't really tell me why I love my daughter. I don't need to have a scientific explanation for why I love my daughter, why you love your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. There are certain questions human beings want to ask that science isn't going to give you the answer to. I mean, is Mozart a better musician than Madonna? Well, but I digress. But you wouldn't go to science. You wouldn't go to science to answer that question. Similarly, to go to science and say, using a scientific methodology, what is the meaning of life? That's silly. You go to other ways of knowing for that. But if you want to know why water flows downhill, right? You don't go to Revelation. If you want to know about the position of the earth vis-a-vis the sun, you don't go to revealed truth. The Sanskrit Holy Bible, the Sanskrit holy books, the Vedas, are interpreted by the Hare Krishnas as indicating the position of the planets and moon is that the earth is here, the sun is here, and the moon is here. And therefore, they reject modern geocentric astronomy because, according to their sacred texts, the moon is further away from the sun. And therefore, we couldn't possibly have landed on the moon. That was a big hoax. That's using revealed truth over empirical knowledge to make a decision about how nature is. What science is good for is telling you about the natural world. But because of that, it's limited to the natural worlds. And I'll probably talk about that in a little bit more. But anyway, science is limited to explaining the natural world. It cannot explain the bigger questions. And for this, we have other ways of knowing, including religion. The Christian origin myth, and remember I'm using the word myth in a non-pejorative sense here, I'm using the term myth very respectfully, as an anthropologist would. The Christian origin myth does answer the question, what is the meaning of life? To Christians, the universe is a special creation by an omniscient deity. The world is created for humankind. People were created specially and occupy a special place in creation. The world was created perfect, reflecting the perfection of the deity, and there is purpose or teleology to creation. The meaning of life, according to Christians, revealed in their holy text, is to serve God, who designed the universe for man's need and enjoyment, and who is to be praised and worshiped in return. This worldview is reflected in many ways in the Genesis creation story, although we don't have time to go into it in detail. But the symbolism is clear, and the metaphors all point to the importance of the relationship of God to mankind and mankind's duty to God. If you think that snake was really talking, you're missing the point. Okay? Like all creation myths, the Genesis story has been very resistant to change. There have been two major disruptions in the Christian worldview, as reflected in the literal interpretation of the Genesis origin myth. And this is, of course, the Copernican, Galilean, heliocentric revolution and the Darwinian revolution. In both of these revolutions, scientific discoveries about the natural world accumulated and caused the rejection of sacred texts as the authorities for natural knowledge about the natural world. In both of these revolutions, in theological circles, they caused a more literalist view of sacred text to be replaced by a more symbolic view. In both of these revolutions, they were rejected by many, at least initially, and are still rejected by some, including heliocentrism. Not everybody is on that particular bandwagon. In my view, those who rejected these scientific views were not necessarily anti-science or unwilling to accept the evidence of science. They doubtless did accept the evidence of science in areas outside of this very important symbolic realm of the Christian origin myth. But those who rejected Copernicus and later Darwin confused the literal interpretation of Genesis with the symbolic and mythic power that these words represent. They confused the literal meaning of Genesis with the meaning of Genesis, which is really much different, much deeper. Even today, the conflict between creation and evolution is not a conflict between religion and science, but between biblical literalist theology and everyone else, theologian or scientists. I often am called by school boards or teachers to help the creationists are coming, what do I do? And one of the first things that I try to do is help them find a clergyman who will be willing to go to the school board and testify that there's really no problem with evolution, that they really think creation should be taught at home and in the churches, but schools should be teaching evolution. Evolution is fine with their theology. Many people are very surprised about this, and there are many ministers who are perfectly happy to tell you that. I remember I did a workshop for some ministers a couple of years ago. It was a retreat, actually, 4 days. We really had a good time. Did a lot of singing. I like that. But I have an anecdote from one of the ministers there who was actually kind of jealous. The Episcopalians had on their marquee a sign at Easter time. They were, of course, trying to encourage people to come in. And the phrase, which sort of sums up the non-literalist tradition in Christianity, it said, "He came to take away your sins, not your brains." But in confusing the literal reading of Genesis with a symbolic understanding, opponents of Galileo and Darwin were also expressing an unwillingness to give up the explanations of purpose and meaning for mere material evidence. And conversely, those who accepted Galileo and Darwin were willing to give more credence to logic and sense impressions than to sacred texts. Heliocentric astronomy wrenched the Christian and Platonic world from its very foundation. Both Plato and the Bible taught that the world was perfect because God was perfect and would create only perfect things. Therefore, the orbits of planet would be circular, and the universe was organized in terms of spheres. Wrong. That was a real shock to find out that the planets had elliptical orbits. We don't think about this being a real theological issue, but hey, 300 years ago, this really made people, sent people to the hanging booth. Both Plato and the Bible taught that the earth had been created by God for humankind. And naturally, the earth, where humans live, would be the most important part of the whole universe, and therefore it would be the center of the universe. Wrong. The early astronomers not only threw the planet Earth from its seat of importance, they also described the universe as changing rather than static. And the ultimate creationist, Platonic and biblical view was that the universe had been created and had stayed that way the whole time and nothing had changed. Hey, things are happening. Planets are moving around. There are various things that are happening. Stars are exploding. This is not a static universe. It's a changing one. Worse than that, it looked as if the universe operated according to understandable and repeatable and predictable laws and generalities, rather than just being something organized on the whim of a creator. Or if the creator did organize, well, of course, that was fine that the creator certainly could have organized it, but he set it up so that it would work without his constant tinkering. Theologians began the long, slow process of stressing the importance and strength of the Bible as myth, rather than its literal accuracy. Even after Galileo and the heliocentric revolution, though, there remained considerable literalism in biblical interpretation, especially considering the Christian origin myth in Genesis. Left intact were many ideas about living creatures, such as essentialism. Even though the physics and chemistry got straightened out a little bit, there were an awful lot of holdovers. Aristotle had taught, and Christianity has absorbed, the idea that living things had been specially created according to a divine plan. Now, each kind of creature, as in the biblical kind, was a representation of an essence or idea, an eidos, in the mind of God. Now, of course, if you look at nature, you find there's a lot of variation, right? You look at rabbits, and not all rabbits have ears the same length. They're not all the same color. Some have longer legs and shorter. Some have thicker fur and so forth. But that didn't matter. That actual variation you see out in nature was not as important as the ideal or the kind, the idea in God's mind of what a rabbit should be. The variation that you saw in nature was irrelevant. Of course, in modern-day biology, the variation you find within a species is what is important, as opposed, and there is no sort of Platonic ideal. The true or type rabbit existed in the mind of God, and that was all that mattered. Furthermore, these essences, as revealed in nature, were ranked in the eyes of God according to a scala naturae, or great chain of being, or ladder of life. And all of nature, living or non-living, could be ranked on this great chain of being, from the most insensible, the single-celled organisms, to multiple-celled organisms, and you get the plants and the insects, and ultimately when you get into higher life forms, you have fish and amphibians and mammals, and guess who's on top, right? Human beings. And above the earthly beings, see, the great chain of being didn't exactly stop with earthly life. Above the great chain of beings, you had angels, and you had Jesus, and finally God himself at the very top. Now, even though humans were no longer the center of the universe in the Galilean model, I mean, after all, the Earth revolved around the sun, and the sun was part of a galaxy, and it was sort of off in the hinterlands of the galaxy at that, as opposed to being the center of creation. But even though the Earth itself was no longer the center of creation, nonetheless, human beings remained the pinnacle of creation. Now, compatible with essentialism was the notion that each creature had been specially designed for a particular purpose. An explanation was considered sufficient if it described the purpose of something, whether biological or non-biological. Rain falls to make the flowers grow. That's a very different explanation of rain than talking about condensation and evaporation, right? There's a difference. If you explain rain by what you learned in 6th grade as the water cycle, condensation, evaporation, et cetera, that's very different from explaining rain as it makes the plants grow. Water flows downhill, not because of gravitation, but because of it's seeking its natural place. Those explanations were considered sufficient before Darwin. We're getting to the punchline here, aren't we? Now, of course, the Aristotelian purpose fit perfectly with a Christian view of a specially designed universe created by God with purpose in mind, went along very well with essentialism of the kinds of animals and so forth. And there were other components of Aristotelian ideas as well, that all living things had been created separately and specially. The fact that dogs and coyotes, that's a bad example because that's a domestic animal. Okay, the fact that wolves and bears have a lot of similarities to one another is not because they shared a common ancestor, because there's a bear kind and a wolf kind. The fact that chimps and gorillas are very similar to one another in almost any respect you can think of is not because they shared a common ancestor, it's because they were separately created as separate kinds. The idea of stasis hung in, even though it was changing greatly in the Galilean universe, as it were. Change had been recognized in astronomy. In the world of plants and animals, in the organic world, it was felt that There had been the creation event, and no change had taken place since that time. The idea that creation was perfect, that you could look at structures like the vertebrate eye, the classic form, and you could see that it had been created for a perfect, and that the whole universe was just great. The whole world was a harmonious, hierarchical place. The great chain of being reigned. And then came Charles Darwin. He was a quiet English scientist who traveled around the world and then became the epitome of the homebody, hardly ever leaving his country cottage after that. But some of the work he did in that country cottage was some of the finest work ever done in science. By the way, you know he didn't just write The Origin of Species. He has a very, very long list of other materials, including 3 volumes on barnacles. He knew more about barnacles than any human being, I think, before or since. He did a lot of very, very careful work and very good observation. Darwin did 2 things in The Origin of Species. Number 1, he demonstrated fully and clearly that change through time, evolution, had taken place, which was not a radical idea, but it was not widely accepted. But he also proposed a clearly stated and plausible mechanism by which evolution could have come about, and this was natural selection. I assume you all know what natural selection is. The thing about natural selection is that it was a natural mechanism. It didn't require a deity to explain it. I couldn't resist this cartoon recently. I'm tired of making decisions. Let's just go with natural selection. Well, like Galileo, Darwin felt that the understanding of nature was predicated on close observation, but he went much further in embracing materialism as the foundation of his science. Nature only was seen by Darwin to be the source of information about nature. He rejected totally any non-natural explanation of the universe, whether Aristotelian essentialism or biblical exegesis. If there was teleology or purpose in nature, it was of a very proximate kind to Darwin. The purpose of a fin is to propel the fish through the water. That kind of purpose. James Rachels, in his book Created from Animals, believes Darwin's anticipation of the storm his materialism would raise was what caused him to delay publishing his species theory for 14 years. After all, it wasn't just the idea of evolution. That had been around. That wasn't so shocking. It was the idea of evolution by natural selection, a natural, non-supernatural explanation for how plants and animals came to be in their present variety. And of course, Darwin was right. The materialist philosophy he brought into studies of natural history caused a much greater storm than just evolution. But what Darwin did is what we do today in science. The way science is performed today is a purely naturalistic paradigm. This is what I referred to earlier and briefly as methodological naturalism as opposed to philosophical naturalism. Our methodological naturalism in science today flows from the realization that science is a limited endeavor that doesn't have the skills to cope with other kinds of explanations, other than natural explanations. We cannot control whether God or spirits or demons or anything else have anything to do with our experiments. We have to conduct science as if only natural forces were operating. And it turns out to be a pretty darn good way of finding about the natural world. But scientific materialism causes certain theologies, biblical literalist theologies, a problem. Well, let me summarize. Where are we today in all of this? If nothing else evolves in the world, religion evolves. The Copernican revolution caused a great change in the relationship of religion to science. Darwin caused another. The Copernican revolution is over. The Darwinian one is still going on. Darwinism, evolution by natural selection, required a wholesale change in the way of looking at the nature of mankind, other organisms, and the deity, the very topics that origin myths are concerned with. Darwin said that teleology or purpose was not necessary to explain nature, that God is not needed to explain how nature works. Let's just go with natural selection. Darwin did not say, nor can science say, that God is unnecessary or that theism is irrelevant to life outside of science. The fact that Darwin removed purpose from nature is irrelevant to the presence or absence of purpose from an individual's life, something that many of the opponents of evolution today do not understand. As Galileo said, quoting a contemporary, "The Bible tells us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go." It's necessary to separate proximate causation from ultimate causation, proximate immediate causation. Science deals with proximate causation. Religion deals with ultimate. When religion tries to deal with proximate causation, it does not do as good a job as science. Religion is not going to tell you whether the position of the Earth is at the center of the solar system or going around the sun. Conversely, by its nature, science can say nothing about ultimate causation. Science cannot tell you if there is or is not a God. Still, there is considerable concern of many that somehow evolution is by nature an evil idea, an idea that destroys religion, as we have seen before, the Henry Morris's quote on evolution being the foundation of all these terrible isms. We still have this attitude, and as such, considerable pressure on teachers not to teach evolution to children, pressure on textbook publishers to water down the treatment of evolution in textbooks, and even pressure on school boards to institute the teaching of, quote, evidence against evolution, which from a scientific standpoint makes about as much sense as having a requirement that teachers should teach evidence against heliocentrism. In my opinion, religion has nothing to fear from evolution, but in my experience, evolution and science in general has much to fear from biblical literalist religion. Thank you very much. Could I have the lights, please?